Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we review books of every genre looking for the best of fun escapist books. And today we're doing a book called Prudence by Gail Carriger. This is the first in a series. It's called The Custard Protocol, and it is a steampunk fantasy adventure book. A lot of fun. The plot is that our main character has been charged by her pseudo-father, a vampire, to go down to India via dirigible, float down to India, and deal with tea cultivation. And that's everything from trade agreements to procuring little seedlings to whatever she needs to do about this valuable tea that they have discovered that needs to be cultivated in India. So the beginning third of the book is all the setup and getting on the dirigible and starting out, and then partway there they discovered shenanigans, things that are going kind of screwy, where she thinks she's there just for tea, but she keeps encountering people who think she's there for other reasons. And then as she encounters supernatural problems and politics and kidnappings and all sorts of adventures along the way, her focus keeps being on the tea, and other people are like, but wait, what about this other issue that she kind of sort of deals with as she's going around? So that's kind of the plot in a nutshell. The author has written a second series called The Parasol Protectorate that takes place before this, like it was the first series he wrote. And this book, I didn't know this when I started it, but it takes place in the same universe as this author's other series. However, it is standalone in that you don't have to have read the previous series to appreciate this book. I will say, however, that the author kind of seems to assume that you have read more than just this book before you start, because the world building is really interesting, but they don't explain very much. For example, in this series we have werewolves and vampires and other supernatural beings in this steampunk Victorian world, and they have rules about them, which tend to be pretty confusing because they're not explained. The author seems to expect you to know stuff about how the vampire hives, they call them hives, work. That apparently the queen of a vampire hive can't leave her building. I'm not entirely certain. Does the vampire queen always have to be female? Could there be a vampire king? I don't understand. But there are also singular vampires. They're not part of a hive, and they might have slightly different rules, but you don't know what they are. So it's really interesting world building, but again, you kind of end up a little bit lost sometimes because the author just assumes you know some things more about what's going on than it is. However, I will say on a positive note, the world building is really interesting. So for example, they use dirigibles to float up to go long distances. So from going from England to India takes a week, maybe 2 weeks in a dirigible. And that's an interesting way of doing it. So they apparently use airships a lot more than water ships. And there's some different things about this, like different levels, and you get to the highest level and it's an aerosphere or arthiosphere or something pronounced like that is different from anything in our world. It's some sort of magical current that has weird effects on supernatural creatures and behaves funny. Like one of the currents, the dirigible spins the entire way as you go. And that's just weird. So there's got some weird things going on about that. There's some interesting political situations, again with the world building on how exactly the British Empire deals with supernatural beings. There's interesting things when it comes to steampunk, like the airships and machinery and what look like cable cars seem to be, and different things like that make the world building really interesting. This also relates to our main character, Prudence, or as she was referred to in this book, Rue. So Rue has completely unique powers in her world. Like, she is special. she has the ability to steal the shape of another supernatural being for a short period. And it really is steal, not just acquire it herself, but the other being loses all supernatural abilities if she touches them. And so the supernatural beings, not unexpectedly, don't really appreciate that. So so a lot of supernatural beings, if they're aware of what her powers are, which she is very famous being unique, they basically like step back. Do not touch me. You know, this is like her defense mechanism. You know, if some supernatural being is threatening her, all she has to do is like take off her gloves and they're like backing up. So that's an interesting special world building specific to our main character. So I liked that. I liked the world building, generally speaking. Again, I would have liked a little bit more detail because I felt a little bit lost on some things, but overall I really liked it. So another thing I like is the humor. So the main character and her compatriots tend to banter back and forth a lot, sometimes flirtatiously, you know, it depends on what character she's talking with, sometimes just humorously. So I'll give you a little example starting on page 69 and going to page 70. So this is humor. We have Virgil, who is, think a servant who takes care of a gentleman named Percy. And Percy is all about his books. That's basically, he's focused on knowledge. He's the stereotypical scholar who has scrolls and maps and tomes and everything. So Virgil is supposed to be taking care of this. Virgil looked askance at a soot-covered girl near his own age, but remarkably scruffy and laddish by comparison. "Good afternoon," he said, remembering his manners. Then he looked up at Rue, panicked. "Himself, Percy, won't like it if this one goes anywhere near those scrolls." Rue grinned. "Ah, good. Spoo, follow those trunks and pretend to be helpful and try to touch them, but don't actually do so." "If you say so, Captain." Spoo, irrepressibly good-natured, trotted off to do exactly as she'd been instructed. Percy instantly panicked and ran after the girl as she rendered what Percy was certain was smudgy doom upon his trunks and satchels of books. Everything else was forgotten as he followed the sooty's stubby form in gangly worry. Virgil brought up the rear, carrying a wicker basket that was yowling in protest and a good-quality hat box. At least Percy would have a good top hat on board, and his cat. "Good, that's him safely ensconced," said Rue. "You're not worried he'll escape?" Prim watched her brother with affectionate exasperation. "I've given instructions for footmen and porters to wall him in with his own books. By the time he reads his way out, we shall be ready to float off." "You're leaving a feeding hole." "I'm not a monster." So that's kind of an example of a very light-hearted tone throughout. Kind of humorous, amusing to read, and it's like that throughout the entire book. It really continues that tone. It's very rarely very serious in its tone, which is really nice. So I liked the tone on this. The language is also pretty, we'll say, flowery, interesting. I'll do a little excerpt on, just kind of give you an example of amusing visuals that the language gives you. Let's see. Okay. Despite her friends' talk of doom, they made it to Bombay with little fuss and no shortage of milk. They depuffed out of the atmosphere to find India spread out below them like a great red and brown apple fritter nestled in a pool of blue sauce. There were sprinkles of green jungle, which, if one continued the comparison, meant the fritter was moldy. So that's an interesting visual of seeing India from above. A fritter that's slightly moldy in a bowl of blue sauce. Okay, so I liked the language. It tends to be flowery, not obnoxiously so, but definitely using, 3-syllable words when one could do sometimes. The author just seems like the kind of person who really likes their language and likes being, having fun with it. So I liked that a lot. So the world building, the language, the humor, these were all great things. Our main character is mostly fun too. I like her powers, I tend to like how she uses them, I like her personality, I like the way she converses with people. I tend to like her. She does have some things that some people might not always appreciate. For example, she is very much a person of privilege. She is a white, aristocratic British woman in the high up in social standing. You know, she's asked to attend all the good parties, so to speak, in England, and she is aware of it. She acts like, you know, this is just her due. She acts like privilege is just what she expects. She expects her servants to act like servants and to give her what she expects. And to some extent, there was a little bit of that was a little bit too much. For example, the very first bit of the book, the very beginning, she is attending a party and she is supposed to steal something from one of the gentlemen at the party. And she does so. She gets away with it. She steals something and runs off. No problem. And they get to the person who asked her to steal it, which happens to be a vampire adoptive father figure, so to speak. Anyway, she gets to him and hands him the box, and he goes digging through it and finds really valuable tea. And so the vampire is like, I wish to do something with this tea. It's extraordinarily valuable and it will, you know, in the future bring untold wealth, kind of thing. And I think about that and kind of go, okay, it's good for a plot device, kind of gets you introduced to all these characters. It was an interesting little heist that she did. It was all really good writing, except for the fact that me as a reader, I am thinking about this in a real world aspect of she just stole something from somebody and probably completely ruined his life because of how valuable this thing was. And the book does not treat it like that. They treat it like a lark and that it's a good thing for her family basically to have this thing and it's gonna kick off all the further adventures of the book. But me as a person in real life who has had thefts happen to them, I think I'm too empathetic with the person that she stole it from and going, that's horrible. How could she do that and not even care that she completely, you know, stole something so valuable from somebody else? So to me, that's that reflection of that privilege that goes to the point of entitlement, that goes to a lack of empathy about those that she is stepping over. Now, this doesn't happen often in the book. Again, this was a one-time incident. It was for plot devices, whatever. But I still didn't like that. It does have some mention, because this is in Victoria, England, when the British Empire is the biggest it's ever been, ever will be. They have some interesting ways of referring to that in this book. It was kind of fun. But there is some discussion about the colonialism aspect of that. You know, how does that imperialistic attitude impact the people that they are imperializing over, that they're colonizing, that they are imposing their culture and their values and their technology on. So there's a discussion on that was actually kind of interesting and thoughtful. It wasn't a lecture about the dangers of imperialism, nor was it really a strong defense of it. It just ended up kind of feeling like it is what it is. But it was an interesting discussion about it, especially about the idea of once technology advances are imposed on a culture, that nobody ever walks them back. Like the technology that is handed over to a culture that does not have that technology is never going to reject it in favor of their pure, undiluted, primitive, I guess you might say, lack of technology. That's just not the way the world works. So that's an interesting little bit of side bit discussion going on. Another thing that's kind of in between, kind of like the colonization thing, is not really a pro, it's not really a con, but this book has a lot of discussion of fashion. A lot. The main characters are very fashion conscious. So, for example, they leave town because of a fashion faux pas. You know, one of the characters, I believe, goes out talking with people, but she was not wearing a visiting dress. She was wearing a sitting dress or a evening dress or a food dress or a carriage dress or some other kind of dress, but it was not appropriate and did not match her hat. And therefore they needed to skip town because it was so dreadfully, scandalously embarrassing. And they talk about, you know, they describe the outfits in great detail frequently, including outfits that, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to tell. They're like, oh, and they changed out of their evening gown to a carriage gown. And you're like, I don't know what the difference of that is, but okay. You know, things like that. That it is interesting. It's kind of fun, maybe a little bit excessive, but it really does build the character of these people because, you know, that's part of their personality of being very fashion conscious. Okay, so some things that I didn't like. Very little, a little bit, like I said, I've already mentioned about Rue's a little bit self-entitled sometimes. But one of the things that I will say on this that I didn't like, although it was not a huge thing in this book, was a little bit, you could tell the author's values are woke in that they don't always mesh with the Victorian values of real history. So what I mean by that is, and usually they clash in a little bit more humorous way. But for example, most of the main characters are female. There's very strong female characters. There is not that Victorian sense of women being second-class citizens. But it's still there in hints. It's, like I said, it's a really weird mesh. So for example, Rue's airship, they get on a dirigible and she's meeting the crew and finds that many of them are female, including like the head of the steam department or the coal department or whatever it is, the fire department, the people that run the downstairs, female. And she doesn't have any problem with that. And but it kind of, she thinks about, oh, this is very unconventional kind of thing. So in reality, having all these women in elevated positions, including Rue being captain of the ship, is not historically accurate, right? But the author is clearly strong enough feminist to not want to deal with history. She just makes it a fantasy, women can do these things, no big deal. And that's not a big deal, honestly. It doesn't come across as preachy, so that's okay. But in different areas, it can be really weird. So, for example, it tries to have the Victorian attitude towards sex and nudity. You know, like, oh, you saw an ankles, how scandalous, but at the same time, not. So to give you an example of this, in the story, two ladies are walking, and some man who is lower class says to one of the women, "Aren't you a mouthful of muffin?" And the woman basically has heart palpitations and needs to sit down because that was just so crude and scandalous and, oh my goodness, you know, bat your fan and sit down, whatever, right? But on the other hand, you have a lot of innuendo about sex, lots of nudity, frankly, because, for example, every time somebody shapeshifts, they lose their clothes. So you shapeshift from a werewolf back to a human, and you need to find something to cover yourself up with. Our main character walks buck naked in front of a whole army regiment of men, and she just walks like, "I'm clothed with my dignity," and goes on, and it doesn't bother her, and no big deal. So you see there's this contrast that doesn't actually really fit together very well. It's like the author really wanted to include the Victorian standards, but the author does not agree with those standards, and so kind of wants to have a sexually liberal woman in a Victorian standard and it to be okay, and so it doesn't really fit well. So our main character doesn't have any problem with basically propositioning a gentleman being like, so teach me the ways of the night, so to speak, and is intellectually aware that maybe that's improper for her to do, but she's like, whatever, I want to do this. And the author treats that as totally okay, because that's the author's value, not because it's either good or historically reliable or anything like that. Anyway, like I said, there's a little bit of wokeness in here. And it's obvious when you're looking for it or when it irritates you. It probably, because we are in a standard where that wokeness is the cultural norm, it probably wouldn't annoy most people. But it is there, so I wanted to bring it out as something that I didn't love. Speaking of sex, though, there is nothing scandalous happening in this book. Our main character does get naked, but not for, romantic purposes. There is no real romance in this except for a lot of flirting, and a lot of innuendo. And that's about as far as this book gets. So this would be totally appropriate for a, young adult as far as that goes. I can't promise that, though, for the next books, because there is the, cliffhanger of the relationship at the end of this that makes you feel like there may be more going on in book number 2. Speaking of which, the book does end on a satisfying note. It does not feel cliffhanger-ish, although definitely it feels like there's going to be more to the story. You can see where it could go on. She's in India. There is no resolution with the tea. That's very important in the story. Everybody knows how important tea is to the British, after all. And there is a resolution to the immediate conflict, but not necessarily the overall story. So that is good. It was a good book. Overall, I recommend it. It was a fun romp. A fantasy adventure, steampunk feel that was a lot of fun. I liked the world building, I liked the characters, I really liked the tone and the humor. And, I kind of want to have more, I want to read more of the stories in this series to find out more about the characters. And I definitely want to read more about I'm pretty sure it was the Parasol Protectorate, that series, to find out more of the world building. I'm really very curious. So overall, 2 thumbs way up. I really enjoyed it. I would recommend it. On to part 2. What I'm going to read next is a mystery. So, A Novel Murder by Elizabeth Penny. So this is the first in a fairly lengthy series that is Secrets on the Castleton Manor Library. And I picked this because, honestly, the cover looked interesting, and the back, it sounds like a major part of this isn't just a dead body mystery, but a mystery about a missing book, a first edition novel, which sounds like an interesting mystery. So we're going to try that for our next book. Thank you for watching, and I hope you join me next week.